The phone call lasted 11 minutes. That's all it took to undo 38 years. One morning, one stranger's voice on the other end of the line. One sentence. Your account is $240,000 past due. And the floor of Nancy's world dropped out from under her. She had signed documents she never read. She had trusted a man who smiled every time he handed her a pen. She had built a life on something she never thought to question. Because why would she? He was her husband. He handled it. But the money was gone. The savings were gone. And the man sitting in her kitchen, refilling the bird feeder like any ordinary Friday, knew exactly where it had all gone. And he had said nothing. For 6 years, he had said nothing. What happens when the person you trusted most turns out to be the greatest risk you never saw coming? The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always did in October, pale and thin, filtering through the red and gold leaves of the maple tree that Gerald had planted in the backyard the year they moved in. That was 1989. Nancy had been 32 years old, pregnant with their second child, and so in love with the idea of the life they were building together that she had cried when she saw the house for the first time. A 3-bedroom colonial on Ridgeline Drive in Spokane, Washington. White shutters, a wraparound porch, a yard big enough for children to run in. She stood at the counter now, 36 years later, pressing the button on the coffee maker and listening to it gurgle and hiss the way it always did. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old wood, the same smell it had carried for as long as she could remember. Outside, a Steller's jay landed on the bird feeder Gerald had built from cedar scraps 2 summers ago, pecked twice at the seeds, and flew away. Nancy watched it go. She was 68 years old. Her hair had gone fully silver sometime in her early 60s, and she had stopped fighting it the way some women did. Gerald always told her it made her look distinguished. She had believed him. She had believed most things Gerald told her, which was, she would come to understand, the central fact of her life. The thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. Gerald Marsh was 69 years old, semi-retired from his accounting firm, and by every external measure, a good man. He coached Little League for 11 years when their sons were young. He served on the board of their church for a decade. He drove slowly in school zones and always held the door for strangers. People in their neighborhood called him Jerry and slapped him on the back at block parties, and Nancy had always felt a quiet pride standing beside him. Not the electric pride of youth, but the steadier, warmer kind. The pride of a woman who had chosen well and knew it. They had 2 sons. Daniel was 40 years old and lived in Portland with his wife and 2 daughters. Kevin was 37 and worked in construction in Boise, Idaho. Both boys called on Sundays, sometimes Saturdays. Both had their father's dark eyes and their mother's stubbornness, which Nancy considered the best possible combination. Her life, by any reasonable measure, was a good one. She had worked for 22 years as an administrative coordinator at Spokane Valley Medical Center before retiring at 65. She had a pension. Modest, but dependable. She had Social Security. She had, she believed, the retirement savings she and Gerald had been building since their 40s. A joint account at Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union that Gerald managed, a 401k, that he had handled on her behalf since she had always found the paperwork confusing, and a savings bond portfolio he had told her was worth close to $200,000. She had never had reason to doubt any of it. The coffee maker finished its cycle. Nancy poured herself a mug, added a splash of oat milk the way she'd done for the past 3 years since her doctor mentioned cholesterol, and carried it to the kitchen table. She picked up the crossword puzzle she'd left unfinished from the night before. Gerald's chair sat empty across from her. He'd driven down to Seattle 2 days ago for what he called a financial conference, something he attended every year, a gathering of regional accountants and retirement planners. He had been going for years. She had stopped asking much about it because the details bored her, and Gerald had always said she didn't need to worry about the numbers. He had it handled. That phrase, "I have it handled," had been the invisible architecture of their marriage for 4 decades. Gerald handled the money. Nancy handled the home, the children, the social calendar, the medical appointments, the Christmas cards. They had a division of labor that had worked, or that she had believed worked, for 38 years. She was halfway through the crossword when the phone rang. She assumed it was Daniel. He sometimes called midweek if the girls had done something funny. She reached for the phone without looking at the caller ID. "Mrs. Marsh?" The voice was professional, slightly formal, with the careful cadence of someone who made difficult calls for a living. "Yes? This is Robert Kellner. I'm a senior loan officer at Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to reach either you or your husband regarding the status of your joint home equity line of credit." Nancy set down her pen. "I'm sorry. Our what?" A brief pause on the other end. "Your home equity line of credit, ma'am. Account ending in 4471. The balance is currently at its limit, $240,000, and the account is 90 days past due. We've sent several notices to the address on file, but we haven't received a response." The coffee mug was warm in Nancy's hands, but she felt suddenly cold all the way through. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We don't have a home equity line of credit." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ma'am," Robert Kellner said carefully, "the account was opened in March of 2019, and your signature appears on the original application. Would you like me to walk you through the account details?" Nancy put the mug down. Her hand was shaking slightly, though she didn't fully register it yet. The maple tree moved in the wind outside. The jay was gone. "Yes," she said. "Please walk me through everything." She spent the rest of that morning on the phone. Robert Kellner was patient and thorough, which she appreciated, even as each sentence he spoke felt like a stone dropping into still water, the ripples spreading outward, touching everything. The home equity line of credit had been opened 5 years ago, using the house on Ridgeline Drive as collateral. The signature on the original application was hers, or appeared to be hers. The withdrawals had been made in increments, 10,000 here, 15,000 there, over the course of 4 years, until the account reached its maximum limit of $240,000. The payments had not been made for 3 months. When she asked about the joint savings account, the one she believed held their retirement cushion, Kellner put her on a brief hold and came back with news that made the kitchen feel smaller. The account balance was $4,211. It had been at that level since August. What was the balance before August? She asked, though some part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. In January of this year, the balance was $187,000. Between January and August, there were 14 transfers to an external account. What external account? A personal checking account, ma'am. Not a joint account. The account is registered solely to a Gerald Allen Marsh. Nancy sat very still. Outside, the wind had picked up. The maple tree bent slightly. Leaves came loose and drifted down across the yard, red, amber, burnt orange, and she watched them fall without seeing them. "Thank you," she said, and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without moving. Then she got up, walked to the small office off the hallway that Gerald called his study, and opened the filing cabinet he kept locked with a combination she had never been given, because he had always said it was easier if he just managed the paperwork himself. The lock was a simple 4-digit combination. She tried their wedding anniversary, Yo65, nothing. She tried Gerald's birthday, 12/04, nothing. She tried the year they bought the house, 1989. The cabinet clicked open. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to find. More denial, perhaps. Evidence that the credit union had made an error, that there was some logical explanation she hadn't considered. Instead, she found 4 years of bank statements, neatly organized in labeled folders, that told a story she had never been invited to read. The withdrawals were methodical, never large enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but consistent, month after month, year after year. The external account, the one in Gerald's name alone, had received the transfers. From that account, the money moved again, to addresses she didn't recognize, to account numbers that meant nothing to her, to a name she had never heard, Coastal Horizon LLC. She Googled it on her phone. Coastal Horizon LLC was a real estate investment company registered in Nevada. Its listed manager was a man named Dennis Farrow, and its registered address was a mail forwarding service in Las Vegas. There were no reviews, no news articles, no website beyond a single placeholder page that said, "Coming soon," in large letters over an image of a Pacific Ocean sunset. Nancy was not a financial expert. She had spent her career coordinating medical office schedules, not analyzing investment structures. But she understood enough to know that a company with no web presence, no reviews, and a forwarding address in Nevada was not a legitimate place to send $180,000. She closed the filing cabinet. She walked to the living room and sat on the couch they'd bought together in 2015. A gray sectional Gerald had complained was too expensive, and she held the phone in her hand for a long time before she knew what to do with it. She called her friend Patricia first. Not because Patricia could help, but because Patricia had been her closest friend since 1994, and Nancy needed to hear a voice that loved her before she did the harder things. Patricia answered on the second ring, and Nancy told her in a flat, careful voice what she had found, and Patricia said nothing for a moment and then said, "Oh, honey. Oh, Nancy." And that was enough. After she hung up with Patricia, she called Daniel. Daniel was 40 years old and worked as a project manager for a tech company in Portland. He was calm under pressure, which Nancy had always admired in him. When she told him what she'd found, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom, don't touch anything else. Don't move any documents. Don't call Dad yet. I'm going to call a friend of mine who's an attorney. Just sit tight." She sat tight. She made another cup of coffee she didn't drink. She watered the plant on the windowsill by the sink, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Gerald called at 2 p.m, the way he always did when he was traveling. "Just checking in," he said, in the warm, familiar voice she had been hearing for 38 years. "How's the weather up there?" "Cold," she said. "The leaves are falling." "I miss you," he said. She said she missed him too. And she kept her voice completely even. And she hung up the phone and sat very still, and thought about all the times she had believed every word he said, and how many of those words she would now have to go back and examine, one by one, like stones she had been walking on for decades that might not be solid after all. The next morning she drove to the credit union. She sat across from Robert Kellner in a small office with a glass partition and a framed print of Mount Rainier on the wall. He was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, with the cautious, practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news regularly. He walked her through the documents again, in person this time, with paper copies she could hold in her hands. The signature on the home equity line of credit application was hers. Or rather, it was her name, written in a hand close enough to her own that she couldn't immediately say it wasn't. She had signed thousands of documents over the years. Gerald had often presented her with papers that needed her signature: tax returns, insurance renewals, refinancing agreements. She had signed them without reading them carefully, because he had always explained what they were, and she had always trusted him. "It's possible," Kellner said carefully, "that you signed this document without fully understanding what it was, or—" He paused. "It's possible the signature was not yours." Nancy looked at it for a long time. The loops of the letters, the slight leftward slant she'd always had. "I don't know," she said. And that was the truest thing she'd said in 2 days. When she got home, Daniel's attorney friend, a woman named Sonia Hale, who practiced family and civil law in Portland, called her. Nancy told her everything: the credit line, the transfers, the Nevada LLC, the locked filing cabinet. Sonia listened without interrupting, and when Nancy finished, Sonia said, "Mrs. Marsh, I want you to do 3 things right now. First, take photographs of every document in that filing cabinet. Second, do not confront your husband until we've spoken again. Third, call your bank and freeze any joint accounts that are still active." "There's barely anything left in them," Nancy said. "It doesn't matter," Sonia said. "We freeze what's there." Nancy did all 3 things. She stood in Gerald's study for 40 minutes, photographing every piece of paper in the cabinet: bank statements, investment documents, transfer records, correspondence with Coastal Horizon LLC that included emails she hadn't seen before, printed and filed with the same neatness Gerald applied to everything. One email, dated March 2021, was from Dennis Farrow to Gerald. It read, in part, "The second phase of the project is behind schedule, but your continued investment is crucial to recovery. I appreciate your patience and your trust. This will pay off for both of us." It had not paid off for both of them. Nancy photographed it along with everything else. Then she went to the kitchen and made dinner out of habit. Pasta, because it required little thought. And ate it alone at the table where she had eaten 10,000 meals beside a man she was beginning to realize she had never fully known. Gerald came home on Friday afternoon. She heard his car in the driveway, the familiar sound of the engine, the particular way the driver's side door closed with a slightly heavier thud than the passenger side. A small mechanical quirk she had registered so many thousands of times it had become part of the background music of her life. She was sitting in the living room when he came in, his travel bag over one shoulder, his gray wool jacket carrying the smell of the road. "There she is," he said, smiling the way he always did when he came home from a trip, warm and slightly relieved, the smile of a man genuinely glad to be back. He kissed her on the cheek. He smelled of coffee and the particular pine-scented air freshener he always used in his car. "How was the conference?" she asked. "Dull," he said. "The usual. Good to be home." He went to the kitchen for a glass of water. She watched him from the doorway. He moved through the kitchen the way he always had. Comfortable, unhurried, completely at ease. He opened the refrigerator, surveyed it, closed it. He refilled the bird feeder through the back window the way he did every Friday when he came home. She watched him do all of this, and felt a disorientation so profound it was almost physical, a sense of the floor shifting slightly beneath her, of familiar things becoming suddenly illegible, like a word you've looked at so long it stops making sense. She had decided, with Sonia's guidance, not to confront him immediately, not until the documentation was complete and she had a clearer picture of what she was dealing with. Sonia had contacts, a forensic accountant named Marcus Webb, who specialized in cases of financial fraud within marriages, and Marcus needed time to review the photographs of the documents before they could understand the full scope of what Gerald had done. So Nancy waited. She did what she had always done. She made dinner. She watched television beside him in the evenings. She answered his questions about her week with carefully edited truth. She called Patricia every morning from the car, parked in the lot behind the public library on Sprague Avenue, where she felt safely removed from the house and everything it now contained. Patricia listened, and occasionally said exactly the right thing, and never once told Nancy what she should feel. "How are you holding up?" Patricia asked on Monday morning. The sky low and gray the way Spokane skies go in late October. "I don't know," Nancy said. "Some hours are fine. Some hours I look at him across the table and I think, who are you? And other hours I think, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe I'm missing something." "Is there an explanation you could live with?" Patricia asked. Nancy thought about it. "No," she said finally. "I don't think there is." Marcus Webb called her on Wednesday of the following week. He had reviewed everything and wanted to speak with her in person. She drove to his office in downtown Spokane, a modest suite on the 6th floor of a building on Riverside Avenue, with a view of the river and the railroad bridge. Marcus was a compact, precise man in his early 50s, with reading glasses he removed when he talked and replaced when he looked at documents. He spread the photographs across his desk and walked her through them with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had done this many times. The total amount moved from their shared financial life into Gerald's private account and subsequently into Coastal Horizon LLC was approximately $260,000, calculated across a 6-year period beginning in 2018. This included the home equity line of credit, the depleted joint savings account, and 2 smaller investment accounts Nancy hadn't fully known existed that had also been liquidated. Coastal Horizon LLC, Marcus said, appears to be what's commonly called a recovery fraud, or a second-stage confidence scheme. Someone, almost certainly this Dennis Farrow, targeted your husband with an investment opportunity, likely promising high returns. When the initial investment didn't perform, He presented Gerald with opportunities to invest more to recover the losses. This is a classic pattern. Your husband may have believed, at some level, that he was protecting the family, that he could make the money back before you noticed it was gone. Nancy looked at the numbers on the desk. Did he lose all of it? Based on what I can see, yes. Most of it went to Faro. Whether Faro is locatable or any of it is recoverable is a question for law enforcement. She was quiet for a moment. Could Gerald have been in on it? Could he and Faro have planned this together? Marcus considered it carefully. It's possible, but the pattern of the correspondence doesn't strongly suggest that. The emails read more like a man who was in over his head and kept throwing good money after bad, trying to fix a mistake he was too ashamed to disclose. He paused. That doesn't make what happened to you any less serious. The home equity line, whether your signature was forged or obtained under false pretenses, is potentially a criminal matter regardless of Gerald's relationship with Faro. Nancy drove home through the gray Spokane afternoon, past the Centennial Trail and the bare cottonwoods along the river, past the neighborhoods she had lived in and near for 38 years, and she thought about what Marcus had said, too ashamed to disclose. She thought about how many times she had asked Gerald, in passing, if everything was all right, if there was anything worrying him, and he had said fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry. She thought about how thoroughly she had not worried. The shame she felt was complicated and layered. There was the shame of having been deceived, the ancient, irrational shame of the person who trusted and was betrayed, as if the trusting itself were the mistake. There was the shame of not having known, of having been so removed from the financial machinery of her own life that an entire architecture of debt and loss could be built without her awareness. And underneath both of those, there was something harder to name. The grief of a woman who had loved a version of a man that may have never fully existed, and who was only now being asked to see him whole. She parked in the driveway and sat for a long time before going inside. Gerald was in the study when she came in. She could hear the television, a news program, the measured cadence of a reporter's voice. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the photographs on the wall. Their wedding in 1986, both of them laughing at something off camera. Daniel at age 5 on a camping trip in the Cascades, Kevin's high school graduation, the four of them at the Oregon coast, squinting into the sun. She had not yet decided what to do. Sonia had given her options. She could file for divorce. She could pursue criminal charges regarding the signature on the home equity line. She could attempt civil recovery. She could do all of these things, or some of them, or none. What she could not do, what she understood now with the clarity that only certain kinds of pain produce, was pretend she didn't know. She had spent 38 years trusting this man with the things she hadn't wanted to manage herself. The money, the accounts, the numbers. She had called it a division of labor. She understood now, standing in her hallway with her coat still on, that it had also been a vulnerability. Not a flaw in her character, not a failure of intelligence, but a gap, a place she had left unwatched because she had trusted someone else to watch it. She would not leave that gap again. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door the way she always did. Then she walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle, because the next few days were going to be hard, and she had learned long ago that hard things were easier to face with something warm in your hands. She chose a Sunday. There was something fitting about it. The day they had always kept as a family day. The day of slower mornings and longer conversations. Daniel drove up from Portland on Saturday night and was sleeping in his old room when Nancy woke at 6, before the sun came up over the eastern hills. She made coffee and sat in the dark kitchen and went over what she planned to say. And when Gerald came downstairs at 7:30, still in his robe, surprised to find Daniel's car in the drive, Nancy said, "Sit down, Gerald. We need to talk." He sat. She watched his face as she laid the photographs on the table, the bank statements, the transfer records, the emails to Dennis Faro, the home equity documents. She laid them down one by one, slowly, without speaking, the way you might deal cards in a game where the outcome was already decided. Gerald's face changed as each document appeared. The color left it, gradually, the way warmth leaves a room when the heat goes off. By the time she'd placed the last photograph on the table, he looked like a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. Daniel came downstairs at 8, drawn by the silence that was louder than noise, and stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks and looked at the papers on the table, and then at his father. And he said nothing. He just pulled out a chair and sat beside his mother. Gerald looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Nancy. "How long have you known?" he asked. 2.5 weeks, she said. He nodded slowly, as if this was information he was filing away. Then he said, "I'm sorry," and his voice broke on the second word, in a way she had not heard from him since the death of his mother 20 years ago. The sound of it moved through her like a cold current, not softening her exactly, but reminding her that this man, whatever else he was also a person in pain. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning. All of it." And he did. It had started in 2017. A man named Dennis Farrow had been introduced to Gerald at a professional conference. Not the annual accountants gathering, but a regional financial planners forum in Bellevue. Farrow presented himself as a real estate developer with connections to emerging Pacific Northwest markets, and his pitch was persuasive. A limited partnership opportunity in coastal commercial properties with projected returns of 12% annually. He had documentation, references, a polished presentation. To Gerald, who had spent 40 years managing other people's money and sometimes felt the weight of his own modest retirement savings, it looked like an opportunity. He invested $20,000. A personal account, not joint. He told himself it was his money, a calculated risk, something he was entitled to try. The first 6 months, Farrow sent monthly reports showing gains. Not dramatic, not suspicious, just steady, plausible growth. Then came the first complication, a regulatory delay on a commercial property acquisition, Farrow said, that would temporarily freeze distributions. But if Gerald could invest an additional $30,000 to bridge the gap, the return on the other side would more than compensate. He invested the $30,000. Then another delay, another opportunity to recover. Then a larger ask, with more elaborate explanations. By 2019, Gerald had invested over $100,000 of his own savings, and the account was nearly empty. He had told Nancy nothing. He had told himself that he would fix it, that one more investment, one more bridge payment, would finally trigger the returns Farrow kept promising. To fund those investments, he had opened the home equity line of credit. "I told myself I'd pay it back," he said, his voice flat and exhausted. "Every time. I told myself I'd make it back and close the account and you'd never have to know." "But you forged my signature," Nancy said. "Or had someone forge it." A long pause. "I didn't forge it," he said. "I presented you with a stack of refinancing documents in March of 2019 and told you they were for our insurance renewal. You signed the stack without reading them. I knew you would. He stopped. Nancy looked at her husband of 38 years. "You knew I trusted you," she said. He couldn't hold her gaze. "Yes." Daniel, who had been silent through all of this, said quietly, "Dad, did you know Farrow was running a scam?" "No." The answer was immediate. "I was a fool. A proud, stupid fool who couldn't admit he'd made a mistake." His voice steadied slightly. "I reported him to the SEC in August, when I finally understood what he was. There's an investigation open." Nancy absorbed this. "Why didn't you tell me in August? When you reported him?" The silence that followed was the most honest thing he'd said in years. "Because I was ashamed," he said. "Because telling you meant telling you everything. And He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I didn't know how to be someone who had done this to you. I'd rather kept trying to fix it than admit what I'd done." Nancy sat with that for a moment. There was a kind of terrible logic to it. Not acceptable, not forgivable in any simple sense, but recognizable. She had lived with this man for 38 years. She knew the shape of his pride. She knew how deeply he had built his identity around competence, around being the person who handled things. "You broke the house," she said. You built a debt against this house that we now have to repay or lose it. I know. Our savings are gone. I know. I'm 68 years old, she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. I have my pension and my Social Security. That's it. That's what's left. Gerald looked at her then, and she saw, under the shame and the exhaustion and the years of careful management, a man who was genuinely frightened. Not of consequences, of her, of what she might say next, of the weight of what his choices had cost the person he had lived beside for almost 4 decades. I know, he said again, and this time the words carried something different. Not just acknowledgement, but the beginning of a reckoning. Sonia Hale arrived at 11 that morning. She had driven from Portland with Daniel and been staying at a hotel in the South Hill neighborhood, waiting for Nancy's call. She sat at the kitchen table with her briefcase and her careful professional manner, and she explained to Gerald, in clear and measured terms, what the options were. The SEC investigation into Faro was ongoing, and Gerald had cooperated fully, which mattered. Recovery of some portion of the lost funds was possible but not guaranteed, and would take time. The home equity line, opened using documents signed by Nancy under false pretenses, could be the basis for a fraud claim. Sonia had already spoken with the credit union's legal department, which was, it turned out, not entirely unsympathetic. Gerald listened to all of it. He answered every question honestly. He provided access to every account, every document, every piece of correspondence with Faro he hadn't already submitted to the SEC. At the end of it, when Sonia had gone back to her hotel and Daniel had stepped outside to call his wife, Nancy and Gerald sat alone in the kitchen for the first time all day. What are you going to do? Gerald asked. Nancy looked out the window at the maple tree, bare now, its branches reaching up against a pale October sky. The bird feeder swayed slightly in the wind. I don't know yet, she said. And that was the truth. She did not know. But for the first time in several weeks, not knowing felt less like falling, and more like standing at the edge of something. Uncertain, yes, but solid beneath her feet. The winter came to Spokane the way it always does. Gradually at first, with hard frosts and iron-gray mornings, and then all at once with a snowfall in late November that buried the garden and silenced the street. Nancy learned to do a great many things she had never done. She learned to read a bank statement. Really read one, line by line, every entry accounted for. She learned the difference between a home equity loan and a home equity line of credit, and why that difference mattered. She learned what an SEC investigation involved, and how long they took, and what realistic expectations of financial recovery looked like. She learned these things because Sonia Hale helped her, and because Marcus Webb walked her through documents patiently and without condescension, and because Daniel drove up every other weekend through December and January and sat with her at the kitchen table going through papers until she understood them. She also learned things about herself. She learned that she was more capable than she had believed. Not more capable than Gerald had told her. He had never actively discouraged her, had never said you're not good with numbers in a cutting way. But she had absorbed, over decades, the quiet message that the financial world was his domain and not hers, and she had accepted that message without examining it. Now she examined it, and she found, in the examining, a competence she hadn't known was there. She opened her own checking account at a different bank. She had her Social Security deposits redirected into it. She met with a financial counselor at a nonprofit on 3rd Avenue who helped her build a budget, a real one, structured around what she actually had. Her pension was $1,200 a month. Her Social Security was $1,400. The house, once the home equity line was addressed, had equity remaining. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't the retirement she had imagined, but it was not nothing. Gerald had moved into the guest room in early November, at Nancy's request. He had not argued. He had taken the smallest amount of space possible, the way a man does when he understands that he forfeited the right to claim more. He continued going to his office 3 days a week. The accounting firm was in its final transition before his full retirement. And he came home in the evenings and made dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the nights Nancy had agreed he could do that. and they ate together with a formality that was strange and sad and occasionally almost comfortable. Patricia came every Saturday morning. They walked the Centennial Trail together when the weather allowed, bundled in heavy coats, breathing clouds of cold air, talking about everything and nothing. Patricia never told Nancy what she should do. She asked questions instead. Good questions, the kind that helped Nancy hear her own thinking. "Do you still love him?" Patricia asked one Saturday in January, their boots crunching on packed snow along the river. Nancy thought about it for longer than the question probably required. "I love who I thought he was," she said finally. "I'm still deciding how I feel about who he actually is. Is there a version of this you could live with, going forward?" "Maybe," Nancy said, "but only if it's entirely different. No more handling things. No more I've got it. We're equals, or we're nothing." Patricia nodded. "That seems reasonable." "I'm 68 years old," Nancy said. Not with despair, but with a kind of deliberate clarity, the way you state a fact that has implications. "I don't have time for relationships that require me to be someone I'm not." In February, the SEC notified Gerald that Dennis Farrow had been located. He had fled to Mexico in 2022, but had been extradited at the end of the previous year in connection with an ongoing fraud investigation involving dozens of victims across Washington, Oregon, and California. The case was building. There was, the investigator told them, a realistic possibility that a portion of recovered assets could be distributed to victims if the case resulted in a conviction. It was not a promise, it was not a certainty, but it was something. The credit union, after review by their legal team and consultation with the mortgage department, agreed to a restructuring of the home equity line, a formal acknowledgement that Nancy's signature had been obtained under fraudulent circumstances led to a renegotiated repayment arrangement that, while not eliminating the debt, made it manageable, given the house's remaining equity. Sonia guided them through every step. Nancy read every document before signing it. Every single one. She told this to Daniel on a Sunday afternoon in March, when the snow had mostly gone and the yard showed the first pale signs of what would eventually be spring. He was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, and she was telling him about the final documents she'd signed that week, and she said, "I read every page. I asked questions about everything I didn't understand. I signed nothing until I understood what I was signing." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, I want to say something, and I hope it's okay. Go ahead. I think what happened to you was terrible and unfair, and Dad should have protected you, and instead he did the opposite." He paused. "But watching you these last 5 months, I've never seen you more like yourself, like the full version of yourself." She looked at her son, 40 years old, with his father's dark eyes and her stubbornness, and his own particular brand of gentleness. She thought about who she had been at 32, standing in front of this house for the first time, crying from happiness. She thought about all the versions of herself she had moved through in the years between then and now. She thought about the woman who had sat at the kitchen table on an October morning and answered a phone call that split her life into before and after. "I think that might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in a long time," she said. She and Gerald had begun meeting with a couples therapist named Dr. Helen Pruitt in late February. It had been Nancy's condition, not for reconciliation necessarily, but for understanding. She wanted to understand how this had happened. Not the mechanics of it, which Marcus had explained, but the architecture of their relationship that had made it possible. How had they built something that could contain such a secret? What had she contributed to a dynamic where his discomfort with failure became her financial devastation? Dr. Pruitt was a careful, incisive woman who asked questions with surgical precision and let silences run their full length. In the sessions, Gerald was honest in a way he had not been for years. Perhaps in a way he had never been, Nancy sometimes thought. The pride he had carried like armor had been stripped away, and what remained was someone more human than the man she had lived with for decades. More fallible, more frightened, more real. She was not ready to forgive him. She was not sure she would ever be ready, in the way the word is usually meant. But she was beginning to understand him, and understanding turned out to be something she needed more than she had realized. Kevin drove up from Boise in April and spent a long weekend. He was quieter than Daniel, more careful with his words, and the conversation between him and his father happened on the back porch on Saturday night, 2 hours after dinner, while Nancy was inside reading. She didn't know exactly what was said, but Kevin came inside afterward with red eyes and sat beside her on the couch and put his arm around her the way he had as a child and said, "I love you, Mom." And she held on to that. In May, she planted the garden. She had always tended the garden, but Gerald had always been the one to plan it, to decide what went where, to do the heavier digging, to build the raised beds from lumber scraps the way he'd built the bird feeder. This year she planned it herself. She bought seeds and seedlings at a nursery on Division Street and laid out the beds with a measuring tape and a notebook, and she dug the soil herself on 2 long Saturday mornings with Patricia beside her, both of them dirty to the elbows and talking about nothing important. She planted tomatoes and zucchini and a row of dahlias along the south fence because she had always loved dahlias, and Gerald thought they were too showy. She planted them anyway. The maple tree in the backyard had been bare when all of this began. By May it was fully leafed out again, large and green, and throwing shade across the yard in the late afternoon the way it always did. She sat on the porch step one evening in late May and watched the light move through it and thought about what the tree had witnessed. 36 years of a life, in all its ordinary complexity and its hidden fault lines and its unexpected capacities. She did not know yet what her life would look like in 5 years. She did not know if she and Gerald would ultimately find their way back to something real, or if the distance between them was permanent. She did not know if Farrow would be convicted or if any of the money would be recovered. She did not know a great many things. What she knew was this: she was still here. She was capable and solvent and awake in her own life in ways she had not been before. She had a garden she had planned herself, and a budget she understood, and a signature she would never again put on anything she hadn't read. She was 68 years old. She had decades behind her full of love and blindness and ordinary mornings, and a betrayal she had not deserved. She had ahead of her. How many years, no one could say. But they were hers. Fully, completely hers. She sat on the porch step and watched the maple tree and breathed the cool evening air of a Spokane spring. And she felt, underneath the grief and the complicated love and the hard-won clarity, something she recognized after a moment as a quiet and stubborn hope. It was enough to begin with. It was, she decided, enough.